Good morning. So I'm sure all of you know this is the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural. So it's very appropriate that we should be talking about a Civil War, post-Civil War topic today. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the forum and introduce a personal friend and colleague, Michael Holt. Michael Holt is the Langborn M. Williams Professor of American History here at the University of Virginia. Mike was educated at Princeton University and earned his PhD at Johns Hopkins University. With time off for visiting professorships and lectureships at Cambridge University, Yale, Stanford, and other institutions, Holt has been at the University of Virginia since 1974. He's written widely and deeply about 19th century American political history. For many years, his writing focused on the years before the Civil War. His book, The Political Crisis of the 1950s, has become the standard on the run-up to the Civil War for advanced college political history courses. His 1999 book, The Rise and Fall of the American Whig Party, Jacksonian Politics and the Onset of the Civil War, was the runner-up for the Lincoln Prize, and is most often described as magisterial, and not just because of its 1,296-page heft. More recently, Michael Holt has written of the Reconstruction period following the war. His, by one vote, the disputed presidential election of 1876 tells the story of America's closest presidential election, which perhaps not coincidentally had the highest percentage of eligible voters participate of any presidential election, 81.5%. Please welcome Michael Holt.
Thank you, George. It was the 1850s that ran up to the Civil War. The other day I was down going into the CVS at the Barracks Road shopping center, and somebody handed me this ersatz $1 million bill, and I looked at the back first, and it said, "The $1 million question is, are you going to go to heaven when you die?" And I ceased to look at that anymore and looked at the front, and who is on this ersatz $1 million bill? Rutherford Burchard Hayes, the Republican winner of the disputed election of 1876. People today who think about the election of 1876, admittedly a small but intensely curious crowd, probably think of it primarily as a precursor to the notorious Bush-Gore contest of 2000. And it's no coincidence, in fact, that 3 years after the 2000 election, 2 new books about the election of 1876 appeared with the 2000 contest clearly in mind. One was by a bitter Democrat. Its title says it all: Fraud of the Century, Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel J. Tilden, and the Stolen Election of 1876, i.e. The Republicans have stolen elections before. The other, interestingly, was by former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, which was a sort of subtle defeat, or a subtle defense of the role of Supreme Court justices in 2000 by talking about their role in settling the election of 1876. There were certainly parallels, sometimes eerie parallels, between the two elections. In 1876, as in 2000, the losing Democratic candidate clearly had a majority of the popular vote. As in 2000, electoral votes were in dispute, including the electoral votes of Florida, but also the electoral votes of South Carolina and Louisiana that were being disputed. In fact, all three of those states sent contesting sets of electoral votes to Washington to be counted. That is, Democratic electors and Republican electors. And as in 2000, Republicans in Washington, including Republican Supreme Court justices, counted Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, in. Actually, the dispute over the electoral votes is not what interested me in this election. I was originally approached by editors of a new series for the University of Kansas Press on presidential elections. They said, would you write one on 1848 or 1860? And as George said, I'd spent a lot of time writing about the antebellum period. I didn't want to do it. I said, why not 1876? Why would I want to do that? Well, I'd written some chapters in a new version of a textbook called The Civil War and Reconstruction, on Reconstruction, chapters on Reconstruction a bit earlier, and I was puzzled by two things. One was the admission of Colorado as the centennial state in the summer of 1876. Why, I wanted to know, did this happen? Because the admission of Colorado with its 3 electoral votes changed the game. Arguably, it was the single most important thing preventing the Democrat Tilden from winning the election, because had Colorado not been admitted as a state, the winning electoral vote majority would have been 184 electoral votes, which is exactly what Tilden got. He was beaten 185 to 184 in the electoral vote count. Absent Colorado, Tilden would have won no matter what happened to the disputed votes from the South. And since the Democrats had a 90-seat majority in the House of Representatives in 1876, I wondered, how could they have been so stupid as to let Colorado in before the election? And the answer is they didn't let it in. When the Republicans still controlled both houses of Congress, they arranged a bill which Democrats allowed to pass when they could have stopped it, that said, if an election is held and a constitution is ratified before July 4th, 1876, the president shall admit it as a state without any further action by Congress whatsoever. So the Republicans neutered future Congresses when they still controlled both houses of Congress. The other, 2 other questions, though, interested me primarily. The election of 1876 is an anomaly in the sense of what happens to political parties during depressions. This election occurred in the midst of a really severe depression. The depression of the 1870s was the most severe depression in the 19th century. And the pattern has been in American politics. This was true in the 1830s. It was true in the 1890s. It's certainly true in the 1930s. That the in-party takes a shellacking in the off-year congressional elections that precede a presidential election, and then they get beaten in the following presidential election. This happened with the Whigs in 1840. It happened with the Republicans in the 1890s. Obviously, it happened with the Democrats in the 1930s. They shellacked the Republicans in congressional elections and then won the presidential campaign. That didn't happen in the 1870s. The Democrats won big. Proportionally, they had the biggest turnaround of congressional seats in American history. Over a third of the seats switched hands from Republicans to Democrats in 1874 and 1875, but then the Republicans won the election, the presidential election, although Democrats at the time would say, no, they didn't win it, they stole it. The third thing that interests me about this election was mentioned by George. And when I asked to write about it, I didn't even know this. It had the highest turnout of voters proportionately of any election in American history. 81.8% of males over 21 apparently voted. Now, some of this turnout was clearly fraudulent. The state of South Carolina reported a turnout of 101% of the eligible electorate. The Edgefield County, which was an upstate county along the Savannah River, reported 2,000 more votes than there were adult males in the county. There was a reason for this, by the way. Edgefield is right across the Savannah River from Augusta, Georgia, where the Masters is. And a lot of Georgians came across the river and voted in South Carolina and then went home and voted in Georgia to push up the total. But this total turnout also includes southern states where the turnout was artificially depressed or repressed by white democratic violence against blacks so that they wouldn't vote Republican. And I want to read you, I think I have this marked at the right spot, give you some examples of this. In Louisiana, three parishes of Ouachita, East Baton Rouge, and West Baton Rouge had 2,100 whites on the voter registration list and 5,300 blacks. They reported together a Democratic majority of 3,000. The registration list in West Feliciana Parish reported 406 whites and 2,200 blacks, yet the reported vote was 485 for Tilden and only 20 for Hayes. In East Feliciana, the registered blacks outnumbered registered whites 2,100 to 1,000, yet the return showed not a single vote for the Republican Hayes and 1,700 for Tilden. The Louisiana parishes at the time, and this I find fascinating, this is probably the one thing from this talk you might remember going away from it. The Louisiana parishes at the time were described as being bulldozed. Bulldozed. And you think back for a minute, wait a minute, this is 1876. There aren't gasoline engines yet. There aren't bulldozers. Why were these parishes spoken of as being bulldozed? And the answer is, as a reporter from the New York Times wrote back, who had gone down to Louisiana after the election, the term bulldoze comes from the practice of whipping blacks with a bull whip if they said they were going to vote Republican. And that is the source of the term we still use, bulldozer and bulldozed. It was giving blacks the dose of the bull whip if they dared to think about voting Republican. So one thing that is very clear is that had this been a fair election, had Southern blacks been allowed to vote freely and fairly, the Republicans would have run away with the election. But they were suppressed to vote, kept from voting in most southern states, except the three, and in some of those that the Republicans still controlled, and Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, where they controlled the returning boards. And I was thinking about this this morning. I used to play tennis with a guy when I still taught at Yale, who came up with a great line. And I'm looking at Paul Gasson, with whom I used to play tennis here. He came up with a line one day that he said, "A good call beats a good shot every time." He just out, out. So a good count, and the Republicans could count the votes. A good count could beat the actual returns any time. I want to get to the dispute in a minute, but let me first of all turn to what might explain this high turnout, this really unprecedented and in a sense unequaled turnout of voters. It wasn't the candidates, although the contrast between the candidates itself is very interesting. It wasn't the candidates because, of course, candidates did not campaign in the 19th century. That was verboten. You didn't go out on the stump. Other people campaigned for you. But yet, the two candidates were interesting. Actually, there were three candidates in this. Well, actually four, but there was a greenback candidate too that I can mention in a minute. But Rutherford B. Hayes was in his third term as governor of Ohio when this election returned. He was a veteran of the Civil War who'd enlisted as a major in an Ohio regiment at the age of 39, was wounded 4 times. He was a hale, hearty guy who was the father of 8 living children at the time of this election. Hayes was an interesting guy. He was a real bibliophile. He loved books. He loved reading. And his collection of books became the basis, really, for the Hayes Presidential Library out in the family estate in Fremont, Ohio, where I spent a lot of time. When you eat dinner every night in Applebee's, you know how small a town is. He was actually introduced in the nominating speech at the Republican convention. You hear this all the time, but the guy actually said it. He's a scholar and a gentleman in introducing Hayes to the Republican convention. The Democratic candidate couldn't have been more different. Tilden was a small, prissy, lifelong bachelor who made a fortune as a lawyer before, during, and after the Civil War. He was serving his 1 term as governor of New York at the time of this election. But he was a very wealthy guy. He had a big house on Gramercy Park that is now something called the National Artists Club. It was his estate, much over the protests of his nephews and things. One of my colleagues, Olivier Zunz, has written about this. It was his estate that was used to build New York Public Library, that massive building on 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue. That's Tilden's money that built that thing. And then the third candidate, interestingly enough, lived across Gramercy Park at the end of Lexington Avenue from Tilden. This was Peter Cooper, the immensely wealthy guy for whom Cooper Union in New York City is named. He was the candidate of a third party, the Greenback Party, that wanted to keep the supply of greenbacks, these unbacked paper money, ample and oppose contraction. And interestingly enough, Cooper's son-in-law, who when he was in New York lived in this house with him on the corner of Gramercy Park and Lexington Avenue, Abram Hewitt was the national chairman of the Democratic Party running the campaign. Hewitt is the guy who won a three-way mayoral race in New York against young Theodore Roosevelt and Henry George, the single taxer, in 1886. So Hewitt lives around the corner from Tilden. In any event, I don't think it's the candidates that explain the turnout. So what were the issues? This is a campaign that occurred in the midst of a serious depression. There's extensive unemployment. There's extensive suffering. Yet neither party offered any proposal for relief, for getting people back to work, for doing anything about the depression, with one exception. But there was a reason for this, and that is that the target of both parties in this campaign were people known as liberal Republicans. These people had bolted the Republican ticket in 1872. They'd nominated Horace Greeley. They were still regarded as an independent voters, and both parties were trying to attract the liberal Republicans who were absolutely against spending any money, the government spending any money. They called for retrenchment. And indeed, Sam Tilden, this is the Democratic candidate, announces in his letter accepting the Democratic nomination, 6,000 words long and filled up all the, went on forever and ever, but he gave his explanation for what had caused the Depression. The problem, he said, is that the government taxes too much. The government has taken too much money out of the economy by taxes, robbing it of this base, these funds for potential investment in the economy, and the way to bring about economic recovery is to cut taxes and cut expenditures. This is the Democratic solution to the candidate. Aside from the Greenbackers, Peter Cooper's party, the major parties didn't offer any hope of immediate economic relief. So what were the issues? Well, one that I don't want to get into happened to be money. And it had to do with this supply of United States notes, or the so-called greenbacks that were in circulation, and what it would take to get back to a gold standard of specie payments. I won't get into that other than to say that both parties were split on east-west lines over what to do about this. There are still some greenbacks in circulation, or at least in people's wherever they keep money as souvenirs. When I was growing up, we had silver certificates, with a blue stamp, and Federal Reserve notes with a green stamp, and then these United States notes with a red stamp. The supply of them now, I think, is almost totally confined to $2 bills. with Jefferson on it. But if you get those notes with a red stamp on it, that is, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, so there's still some of those around. But what to do about those, whether you have to contract the supply of them in order to get back to a gold standard, was one issue. Another issue that was dear, very dear to the Republicans was an open attack on Catholics and a denunciation of a supposed Catholic threat to the public school system. This was all fictitious, but this was certainly Hayes thought this was the winner. This is the issue that's going to win the election for the Republicans, is saying that Catholics are a threat to the public school system. A big issue for the Democrats, of course, and the Republicans had to go along, was reform. We're going to reform government. And the Democrats just ticked off, remember, this is an election with Grant still in the White House and the corruption associated with Grant's administration. And the Democrats are saying, we're going to clean up government. We need a new party to do it. The Republicans are saying, we're going to clean up government. We've got Hayes, who's clean as you can get. But the reform issue, which was administrative reform, let's just get honest people in office, not, again, economic reform of any kind, was a big issue. But matching that, and I think this is largely responsible for the turnout, is that the Republicans engaged in waving the bloody shirt. Now, this was an old Republican tactic since the Civil War. It refers to accusing the Democrats as being the party of the Confederacy, the party of Confederates, and if the warning here was, we're not promising any more programs to protect black voters in the South, but if the Democrats win, the Confederates are going to get back in power. And if the Confederates get back in power, you know what they're going to do. And this was a great church. You know what they're going to do. They're going to pay all those former slaveholders with federal money for all the value, the dollar value of what they lost because of emancipation. And I have to say, the Democrats helped the Republicans make this charge because one of the things they did is that the Democrats take over the House of Representatives in December of 1875. The first thing they do is fire all these clerks that had been hired, almost all of whom were Union Army veterans, one arm, one leg. They're all fired, and they replace them all with Confederate Army veterans. And so the Republicans say it's going to be Union soldiers to the rear, rebel soldiers to the front if the Democrats win this election. And I think the bloody shirt was probably the reason for the large turnout in the North, and it's 99% in Iowa, 98% in Indiana. These are huge turnouts in this election of the eligible voters, but it also caused this enormous increase in the white vote in the South because they saw this as the last chance to get rid of these federal oppressors, these Republican regimes. And there's a demonstrable increase in the white turnout for Democrats in the South in this election, which helps explain the turnout. I was going to give you some great examples of rhetoric from this election, but let me move on. So what was the dispute about, and how was it handled? Both sides claimed that they had carried Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. They sent competing electoral votes to Washington, as I said. Who won those states was going to be determined by returning boards that were controlled by Republicans in all 3 states. These were the last states that Republicans controlled during Reconstruction. And it was clear the morning after the election that Tilden had this 184 electoral votes, and that Hayes had 166, and that these 19 electoral votes from the South were being disputed. Democrats, by the way, also tried to steal a vote that they didn't deserve from Oregon by challenging an elector, but the real dispute was these 19 votes from the South. And just like 2000, which I think was clearly the most exciting presidential election of my life, because it lasted so long. It went on for weeks and weeks after the election. Both sides lawyered up. Well, at least they lawyered up in Florida and South Carolina. And with Louisiana, they just carried cash, and the returning board was clearly up for sale in Louisiana. I mean, they offered to both Democrats and Republicans, you know, if you give me $100,000, I'll make sure you get the votes. But this is the first election, interestingly enough, where both parties in South Carolina and, well, actually in all 3 states, the parties go to the courts. This is the first presidential election in the 19th century that I know of where people go to courts seeking rulings that's going to give them an advantage. And the use of courts in Florida was particularly interesting. A Democratic judge gave writs of quo warranto or ranto to the Democratic electors to serve on the Republican electors. Writs of quo warranto are, by what right do you hold this office? And you've got to appear in court and prove that you deserve to cast the electoral vote for that state. Later, the Supreme Court of Florida, the state Supreme Court, rules that in fact the Democrats had won the election. Interestingly enough, the people who settled the election in Washington reject that claim with exactly the same logic that they used in Bush v. Gore. The Constitution specifies that state legislatures will determine how electors are chosen. State courts have no say in the matter whatsoever. It's beyond their jurisdiction. Only state legislatures can decide this. Okay. Anyway, contested electoral votes are sent up to Washington, and the question is, how do we count them? How do we count them? The 12th Amendment to the Constitution specifies that electors are to meet on a certain day. It was December 6th, 1876 in this case. Cast their votes, have them signed by the governor of the state, put them in sealed envelopes, and send them to the president of the Senate. And at a meeting of a joint meeting of the House and the Senate, whether it was a joint session was actually something that was hotly disputed at the time, but a joint meeting in the House chamber of the House and Senate. The 12th Amendment says the president of the Senate, this was a Republican named Thomas Ferry, the vice president had died, shall open the votes, and then the language is this, and the votes shall then be counted. Never in American history has the imprecision of the passive voice meant so much. Counted by whom? You want to avoid the passive voice. We try to tell students that all the time. Counted by whom? Well, there was a massive dispute. The Republicans said, well, it means the president of the Senate can count them because the Republicans had a majority in the Senate. The Democrats, who have this huge majority in the House of Representatives, say, no way, if you insist on that, we're simply not going to hold a joint session. You have to come over to the House chamber for this. We won't count the vote. Nobody will have an electoral majority because we won't count any votes. And the Constitution says if nobody has an electoral majority, the House of Representatives will pick the president and we'll pick him ourselves. Or we'll use the 22nd joint resolution, which the Senate had repealed, but there's a big question whether one chamber can repeal a joint resolution. This allowed, I remember several judges saying, this is flatly unconstitutional. It allowed any member of the House or Senate, when the votes are counted, to challenge one or all electoral votes from a state. The House and the Senate go to their separate chambers. If any House upheld this challenge, the electoral votes are thrown out. The electoral votes are thrown out by a challenge from this. The Democrats threatened to use that. So there's sort of a stalemate, and then they come up with this idea of forming what became known as the Federal Electoral Commission. I'm watching. And this called for 5 members of the Senate, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, 5 members of the House, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and 5 members of the 5 justices of the Supreme Court to hear disputed returns when they came up. The way the members of the court were to be picked is that the bill forming this commission cited certain circuits. In those days, the Supreme Court justices still rode circuit. We want such and such a judge from this circuit and that. And it came with 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And those 4 guys were to pick the 5th member, and they had to be from associate justices. Nobody wanted the Chief Justice on this. And everybody believed this was going to be David Davis, a fat judge from Illinois who'd been run Lincoln's campaign in 1860. But the day before Congress is going to vote on this bill, the Democrats in the Illinois legislature, along with some greenbackers, third-party men, elect David Davis as the next U.S. Senator from Illinois to replace a Republican, Blackjack Logan. Davis refuses to serve on this. He said, I'm not a judge anymore. He refuses to serve on this electoral commission. So the 4 guys pick another guy named Joseph Bradley from New Jersey. What happens? Well, to give you the bottom line, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, the votes are counted in the joint session, and this is a picture of the actual painting of the actual joint session in which the votes were counted on the book. When they got to Florida, the disputed returns are sent to this commission. And on all the disputes, there's a dispute over this one vote from Oregon, too. On all of the disputes, the commission votes 8-7 to give the votes to Hayes. 8-7. There's another one vote count there, actually. 8-7. So Hayes is counted in. But the Democrats, and this is the scene I want to leave you with, what a scene it would have been if it had only happened. The Democrats still didn't get up. Once it was clear that this commission was going to rule for the Republicans, because there are 8 Republicans on it and 7 Democrats all the time, people start writing Tilden. And they say, we want you to go to court and get writs of quo warranto, or warranto, to serve on Hayes. And one guy he said, I want you to get that writ of quo warranto, and I want you to be at the inauguration on Inauguration Day, and after he takes the oath of office, but before he gives his inaugural address, I want you to serve it on him right there on the steps of the Capitol. So he spends all 4 years in court trying to defend his right to hold office. That would have been a scene for the history books. Thank you.
I invite those who would like to ask questions of Professor Holt to join me in the back of the room in just a minute. We will have time for a few questions. Michael, I'd like to kick it off by asking, what difference did this election make? I know that you argue in your book that the policy differences between the two parties were slight, and probably if this election had gone to the Democrats, it might very well not have made a great deal of difference in what happened over the next several years. And you argue that the restoration of political equilibrium is the important legacy of the election of 1876. Could you expand on that a bit?
Geez, George, you did read the book. Holy cow. Yeah, why? Well, first of all, let me expand on why I don't think it made any difference. Hayes is often accused of betraying the last vestige of Reconstruction by ordering, people say he removed troops from the states, the remaining states. He didn't remove troops, he ordered them back to their barracks away from state capitals. But in fact, Grant had given that order even before Hayes was inaugurated. It just went astray. But can we believe that if the Democrat had got in there, he wouldn't have removed those troops from the South? There was an attempt, but it was a stalemate to get a constitutional amendment, a so-called Blaine Amendment, prohibiting public support for Catholic schools. At that time, by the way, the Bill of Rights had not been incorporated, as it's called by courts, which meant that people said it only applies, this prohibition about religion applies only to the federal government. States are allowed to establish religion and aid religion if they want to. But there was never a chance that constitutional amendment would pass, even though it had been an issue in the campaign. Specie payments were resumed on January 1st, 1879, just as the Republican law called for. I don't think it would have been any faster, and it certainly wouldn't have been any slower had Tilden won the election. The one area that one has to guess in that is we know that there was a massive violent strike by railroad workers in 1877, and that Hayes ordered federal troops in to break up the strike in a number of cities. It's difficult for me to believe, since Tilden's was so close to railroads and he made all this money from railroads and merging railroad companies, that he wouldn't have done the same thing to protect the owners of the railroad property, but that's iffy. The equilibrium that I'm talking about is that Republicans had won 4 elections in a row, going into presidential elections in a row. They'd controlled both houses of Congress since 1860. It was a dominant majority, and what happened in this election, because of the increase in the Democratic vote, especially in the South, that the parties grew towards equilibrium. And indeed, until the 1890s, except for a 2-year stretch, you had this same situation where the Democrats controlled the House and Republicans controlled the Senate. At the same, and in many northern states, the parties became much more competitive than they'd been for the remainder of until the so-called voter realignment of the 1890s. Whereas it was this election, and this election, although you could see it from the 1874 congressional terms, that really you have the real evidence of a one-party Democratic South, which really shows up in congressional returns from the former Confederate states, despite the dispute over the electoral votes.
Hi, I have a couple questions sort of relating to today. My first is, if the U.S. system is so great, then I wouldn't think there would be so many disputed elections. I was wondering if you think it's just inevitable in a country like ours where discussion's so valued, or if there's a better way. And then the second question is, do you think the issues today are not as mobilizing as the issues of the 1876 election, or is there another reason why voter turnout's so low?
Good question. I don't think the issues, if I can take your second question first, are as mobilizing, because the Civil War was still fresh in people's minds in 1876. And when the Republicans said, the damn rebels are going to get control of the national government, everything we fought for is going to be wasted, this was a gut issue, an issue with gut appeal, and whites in the South said, we're fighting for white supremacy. They made no bones about it. I mean, the Southern Democrats, their rhetoric was very ugly, and this was an issue with appeal. There also, I think, the parties had to work very hard to gin up that kind of turnout. There were big machines. Most of you probably don't know it. My colleagues from the history department do. But in the 19th century, state governments and local governments didn't print ballots. It was up to political parties themselves to print and distribute ballots. So it took a lot of manpower to get those ballots to the polls, and they would do what they called canvass voters. They'd find out beforehand who was going to vote for whom, and they'd work very hard to get those people to the polls. With regard to your other question, it seems to me, in fact, that what is remarkable about American history from 1788 on up to the present is how few disputes there have been about the results of presidential elections. We had two go to the House of Representatives. And I don't know, how many people here know that in the original Constitution, before the 12th Amendment, it said the top 5 candidates at electoral votes will go to the House to be decided on, rather than the top 3, which was in the 12th Amendment. So we had in 1800 and 1824, you had elections go to the House of Representatives. You clearly had a violent reaction to the results of the 1860 election. It provokes secession in the Deep South, but you didn't have people disputing the results. They could be angry about the results. Again, it seems to me what is interesting is how few the disputes have been, not how many there have been.
I thought the statistics you gave on the how the whites kept the blacks out of the South voting, it was astounding. And my question is, weren't there still federally controlled troops in the South that the Republicans could have used to help, if it would have made such a huge deal in the election had the blacks been allowed to vote, to help kind of ensure that they were protected and could have voted?
There were very few troops, but Grant, that's a good question. Grant had ordered troops to South Carolina because the so-called red shirts or rifle clubs there refused to turn in their weapons when the Republican government asked for it. But all of those troops were stationed at the polls. They were there, and there were federal supervisors in the South as well as in northern cities, actually, at the polls. But what the Democrats did was to stop blacks before they got to the polls, out of sight of the troops, to keep them from voting. Let me give you one example that is just sort of hair-raising. But it was testimony before the returning board in Louisiana. from a black woman. And she comes under guard of soldiers and relates the following story. A gang of whites came to our house 2 days before the election. They asked my husband who he was going to vote for. I was standing there with a baby in my arms. He said he was going to vote Republican, and they shot and killed him on the spot. They shot and killed the baby in my arms, and they stabbed me and gang raped me. This is what whites were doing in these states to intimidate blacks. What is extraordinary, actually, if you look, and take Louisiana the case, we have a great senior thesis written by one of my former undergraduate students here. The guy later clerked on the Supreme Court. He was a good guy, but he did this study that showed actually black turnout for Republicans, despite all this harassment, increased in 1876 from previous levels. But what he also saw is that whereas about 60% of whites had voted in 1872, 94% of them voted in 1876 for the Democrat. This huge increase in white turnout in the election.
Professor Holt, thank you very much. Really interesting topic and an interesting presentation. It brings to mind some of your comments with regards to Catholicism, which affected the 1932 election, as well as was very prominently discussed in the 1960 election. Also, the vote of the dead, or there are more votes cast than there were people present, happened, at least rumor had it, happened in Chicago in the 1960 election. Any comments on those, please?
Well, there certainly were rumors about that in Chicago in 1960, and there probably had some basis to them. I think the Catholic issue was more central actually in 1928 than it was in 1932 because Al Smith was the Democratic candidate. Let me comments on this. Well, I don't think dead people voted in South Carolina. I know the comment. I want to write this down while I remember it. Real people voted, they just weren't residents of the county in which they voted. They rode over from Georgia, and they often voted. South Carolina did not have a registration list of voters. And this actually ended up the biggest challenge that Democrats made to the South Carolina results. They said the state constitution requires that voters be registered, and they've never been registered. The whole election is unconstitutional. You've got to throw out the votes of South Carolina. Real people voted, they just voted illegally. But what I wrote down was, and I didn't get into this, what was feared by Democrats when they found out that the Republicans were going to Florida in particular, and what was feared by Republicans at the same time actually was that Florida was a big state, and most of the people who lived in it were up in the northern counties. But there were people down in Key West and other counties. It took a long time for the vote to get in. What Republicans feared, and one legal maneuver by Democrats was, what they want to do is they want to find out. They want to hurry up the count of the vote to find out how many votes Hayes has. So then they can rig the returns from these counties that hadn't turned in yet to win the election. And this is Lyndon Johnson's first election to the Senate in Texas, with all those South Texas votes. He waits to find out what he needs, and they are ginned up for him.
Yes, quick question. What do you see as the essential difference between 1876 and 2000? Is it just voter intimidation in 76?
Joe, that's a good question. Well, voter intimidation is certainly one of the big differences. The other difference is minor, but it's intriguing to me, is that there was far more tribunal shopping in Florida in 2000. You know, let's find the judge that's going to rule our way, than there was in either Florida or South Carolina in 1876. I mean, you had odd things that the South Carolina Supreme Court jailed the entire Republican returning board for contempt of court because they brought in returns before the Supreme Court said they could. But there weren't as many. You couldn't forum shop as much then as was true in 2000.
Professor Holt, thank you for coming. I have a couple questions. The first one was, it seems to me that nowadays every disputed election ends up with the argument being brought up that the Electoral College should be abolished. I was wondering, A, if that was present at this time, and the second question that I have for you was, how salient were discussions of fraudulence to the general public, and did that public opinion matter in 1876?
There were a lot of discussions among Democrats who were bitter about the result after it was elected, and there were a lot of people who considered Hayes a fraudulent president for most of his term. I happen to like Hayes. I find a lot about him that's admirable. He was a scholar and a gentleman. He collected books. He liked books. I'm sorry. Remind me of the second. The other.
Essentially, just in an age of a lack of expansive media coverage on a disputed election like this, how much did the public opinion matter? And also, were there discussions of abolishing the Electoral College?
Oh, yeah, that's good. Actually, 2 years before the event, in January and February of 1875, a Republican senator from Indiana named Oliver P. Morton gets up in the Senate. He said, we're going to have a crisis counting the electoral votes because the Democrats are going to control the House and the Republicans the Senate. We're heading for big trouble if this happens. And he said, what we have to do is change the way we count electoral votes. And he proposed a constitutional amendment. He said, he went over, he said, you know, there's, the electoral vote totals are wildly disproportionate to the popular vote totals. And all these elections, he said, what we need to do is have 2 statewide electoral votes in each state and all the other electors chosen by congressional district so the minority counts. Let's get rid of winner take all. I think that's a terrific idea. And actually, that used to be the way before you adopted winner take all systems. Public opinion mattered. As I argue in the book, these committees of so-called visiting statesmen of Democrats and Republicans that go down to Louisiana. It's no surprise that a lot more people wanted to go to New Orleans, which was then the state capital of Louisiana, than go to Tallahassee. So there were a lot of them there. They're all staying in the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans. Their biggest concern, because the returning board there reeked of corruption. Everybody knew it was corrupt. Everybody knew their votes were for sale. it was a big PR campaign on the part of everybody. Let's make sure that this the North can accept. People in the North can accept the decision that Louisiana is going to make. So they were concerned about public opinion. Public opinion was very upset. I mean, I don't particularly like Tilden. I admire his bequest to the New York Public Library, but Tilden received literally scores of telegrams and letters saying, I can raise 5,000 troops tomorrow, and we're going to march on Washington and install you at the point of the bayonet. Scores of letters like this. There were talk of appointing Civil War veterans, George McClellan or Winfield Scott Hancock, to lead this Democratic Army and march on Washington. And Tilden said, no way are we going to do that. I think it was his finest hour in this dispute that we were not going to resort to armed force like that.
Following the 2000 election, I was at a small breakfast where one of the chief counsel for one of the parties was talking about the election, and he commented that it is not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes that counts.
Right. That's a good call.
True.
It's a good shot.
True in 2000, true in 1876.
That's right.
Thanks, Michael Holt.
Okay. Very good.